The Battle of El Herri was fought between France and the Berber-Zayan Confederation on 13 November 1914. It took place at the small settlement of El Herri, near Khenifra in the French Protectorate in Morocco. The battle was part of the Zayan War, in which the Confederation of Tribes sought to oppose continued French expansion into the interior of Morocco. Having captured the strategic town of Khenifra earlier in the year, the French, under General Hubert Lyautey, entered negotiations with Muharrar Hamouzayani, who led the Zayan. Lyautey thought that peace could be achieved and ordered Lieutenant Colonel René Lavardure, who commanded the garrison in Khenifra, to not launch any offensives. Lavardure became frustrated with the lack of action and, on 13 November, led almost his entire garrison in an attack on the Zayan encampment at El Herri. The attack initially went well, with his artillery and cavalry clearing the tribesmen from the camp, looting the Zayan tents and capturing 2 of Hamu's wives. However, the French encountered a significant Zayan force during its withdrawal to Khenifra. This force engaged the French with harassing fire, forcing them to move only under the cover of their artillery. Lavardure then ordered his wounded back to Khenifra with a guard of a company of infantry, which were joined by large numbers of other troops who broke ranks to join the column. Whilst making a river crossing, Laverge's rear guard and artillery were overrun and annihilated. Laverge's remaining troops then formed square and fought a desperate last stand against several thousand tribesmen before they were also overrun and killed. The French losses were significant. Some 623 men were killed and 176 wounded. The Zayan lost around 182 men killed. The column of wounded reached Khenifra just ahead of pursuing Zayan forces and the town came under siege. Lyautey was dismayed at Laverge's actions and was briefly of the opinion that he had cost him the war. However, a relief force reached Khenifra within a few days and the situation stabilized. The Zayan War lasted until 1921, when negotiations secured the submission of much of the Confederation to French rule and a military offensive pushed the remainder into the high Atlas Mountains. Background: France's Protectorate of Morocco was established after French intervention in the Agadir crisis of 1911. Resident General Louis Hubert Lyautey served as the head of government, and one of his main aims was to secure the Taza Corridor in the Middle Atlas Mountains linking Tunis to the Moroccan Atlantic coast. He was opposed by the Berber tribes in the area, amongst them the Zayan Confederation led by Muharrar Hamouzayani. Hamur had opposed the French intervention since 1877, and led between 4,000 and 4,200 tents of people. French attempts to persuade Hamur to submit had failed, and in May 1914 Lyautey authorized General Paul Prosper Henri's to take command of all French troops in the area and launch an attack on Taza and Khenifra, vital parts of the corridor. Despite some fierce engagements with the Zayan in the Khenifra area, Henri's secured the 2 towns by the middle of June and inflicted substantial losses on the tribes. As part of the defense of the area, Henri's established 3 groups mobile columns of troops who could react quickly to threats. A group mobile was established at Khenifra under Lieutenant Colonel René Lavardure, another to the west under Lieutenant Colonel Henri Claudel, and a third to the east under Colonel Noel Garnier Duplessis. July saw increasing attacks on Laverge's command and the outbreak of the First World War, which significantly reduced the number of French forces based in Morocco. Lyautey was determined to hold Khenifra to use as a bridgehead for further expansion of French territory, and referred to it as a bastion against the hostile Berber masses, upon which the maintenance of his occupation depended. Successfully repulsing additional attacks on Khenifra, Henri's thought he had the upper hand, having proven that the reduced French forces could resist the tribesmen. The Zayan were now contained within a triangle formed by the Oum-Arabia, the Siru River and the Atlas Mountains, and were already in dispute with neighboring tribes over the best wintering land. Battle. Laverge's attack. Laverdure had been in Khenifra for 5 months when Hamor set up camp at El Herri, a small village 15 kilometers away, for the winter. Hamor had been promised peace talks and had just lost control over 5 tribes who began negotiations for submission to French rule. Henry's believed that Zayon resistance was near its end and that the war would soon be over. Lyautey wished to keep the situation calm and twice refused Laverdure permission to attack the camp at El Herri, for fear that it would affect the peace talks and that Laverdure had insufficient forces available for the assault. He was instead ordered to keep to the French bank of the Oumarbia and had permission only to send troops out for convoy protection, wood gathering and road building. However, Laverdure decided to disobey his orders to remain in Khenifra and marched on El Herri with almost the entire garrison. He was said to be frustrated with the lack of action on the front and may have been persuaded by a Maxan soldier eager to avenge a personal affront he had received from Hamor. Laverge's column consisted of 6 companies of Algerian and Senegalese tirailleurs, a party of Gaumiers, 2 batteries of 65 mm and 75 mm cannon, and a squadron of spy cavalry numbering 43 officers and 1,187 men in total. This amounted to less than half the troops he had had in September when he was first denied permission to launch an attack. Laverdure marched at 2:30 a.m. on the morning of the 13th of November 1914 without informing his superiors, only leaving behind a note saying he was going to annihilate Hamor's camp. Laverge's column reached El Herri at dawn and found the encampment of 100 tents. Most of the Zayon men were out of camp at the time, leaving behind the non-combatants, and Laverdure achieved complete surprise. The first that many of the Zayon knew of the attack was when his artillery shells began exploding amongst the tents. This was followed up by a cavalry charge which cleared the camp but was halted by a group of tribesmen who had rallied on a hilltop to the south and inflicted numerous losses on the horsemen. Laverdure had to send in his infantry to remove these Zayon before looting the encampment. Hamor escaped in time, but 2 of his wives were captured before the French headed back to Khenifra at around 8:30 a.m., leaving the looting to tribesmen of the PHGCOM, formerly Hamor's allies, who assumed he was now beaten. Zayon counterattack urged on by the shrieking of their womenfolk, all of them, even any who before may have been somewhat hesitant, appear all round the horizon. Onward, through the rain of machine gun fire and shells they rush, wedging in and out through the underbrush and rocks until they are right up onto the French units already hampered by having to carry their dead, whom they must preserve from mutilation, and their wounded whom they must save. In 1914, at El Herri, an entire French column was thus almost totally annihilated. A French staff officer describing the loss of the column at El Herri, the return to Khenifra was initially hampered by attacks by small groups of tribesmen who were successfully beaten, but not before they discovered the relatively small number of troops in the French column. Word was passed to others in the area and soon a force, estimated at 5,000 strong by the French, was assembled. These men consisted of almost the entire Zayon tribe and elements of the Emratan, 8 Harkat, 8 Askak and 8 PHGCOM. Zayon tactics were to harass the flanks and rear of the column and to occupy any high ground available for sniping attacks. The French found they could not move in safety without heavy covering fire from the artillery, which was reduced in effectiveness by the dispersal of the Zayon tribesmen and their use of cover. Hamor's nephew, Maharawaka, led a force of several thousand tribesmen around the French to cut off their route to Khenifra. At this point Laverdure ordered 1 company of his Senegalese infantry to leave the column with a convoy of wounded soldiers which he sent back to Khenifra. However, many of his other troops, seeing the Senegalese leaving, broke ranks and followed in panic. Laverdure attempted to continue his withdrawal but, just having crossed the Chabuka River, His rearguard was surrounded and attacked repeatedly from all sides, being quickly overrun. The gun batteries soon suffered the same fate, their crews also being killed. The Zayan assembled on the ridges surrounding the remaining French troops, who had formed a defensive square, before launching a final attack with several thousand men. This attack lasted just a few minutes and, after a desperate struggle, the square was broken and the remainder of the column was wiped out. The Zayan chased down and killed any of the survivors who attempted to hide in the scrub. The wounded and their escorts struggled into Khenifra at about noon, narrowly outpacing the Zayan, who had stopped to loot the bodies of the French dead. These men, numbering 171 men and 5 officers wounded and 426 men and 5 officers able-bodied, were the only French survivors of the battle. A total of 623 Frenchmen had died, along with around 182 of the Zayan. French losses amounted to 218 Algerian or Tunisian tirailleurs, 210 French soldiers and 33 French officers, 125 Senegalese tirailleurs and 37 Moroccan goïms killed. The French officers suffered the highest casualty rate of any group, with 90% of them being killed or wounded. 4 of the 5 unwounded officers belonged to the cavalry. Around 65% of the entire force had been killed or wounded, and the French were forced to abandon 4 machine guns, 630 small arms, 62 horses, 56 mules, all of their artillery and camping equipment, and much of their personal belongings on the battlefield. Herri took much of this with him when he escaped to the mountains of the Middle Atlas. Aftermath. The disaster left Captain Pierre Crawl as the senior officer of the remnants of the Khenifra garrison, some 3 companies of tirailleurs. Having secured the defences, he immediately telegraphed Lyotte and Henry's to inform them of events, the first they had heard of Le Verger's foray. Lyotte was briefly of the opinion that the event would cause the loss of the whole of Morocco. The next morning Zayan horsemen appeared on the hilltops to the south and east of the city. Khenifra soon came under constant siege from the tribes. Henry's left Fez for Meknes, from which he telegraphed Lyotte promising to strike hard and fast, so that the La Verger disaster did not threaten the French position in Morocco. He said that everyone, everywhere must be aware of the fact that our forces are numerous, that strong columns are already on their way to Khenifra, and that the repression will be swift. Henry's dispatched Garnier Duplessix's group mobile to Khenifra from El Gras and ordered Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Derigoan to form another group at Ito for mobile support. Garnier Duplessis was forced to fight his way through groups of Zayan tribesmen and did not reach the town until the 16th of November. Henry's joined Derigoan and entered the town himself 2 days later, encountering no resistance on the way. Another part of the Khenifra relief force was the 6th Battalion of the 2nd French Foreign Legion, who marched from Mrirt and saw action at El Hammam, and along the Oumrabia. By the end of the month, the French garrison had swelled to 7,000 troops, an all-time high. Henry's, Garnier Duplessis and Crawl were all promoted shortly after the battle in recognition of their actions to prevent the loss of Khenifra. As a show of force, Henry's led excursions from Khenifra to El Herri on 19 and 20 November. He observed many campfires and some groups of tribesmen, but on the whole the Zayan, who had moved their main camps away from the area, kept their distance. Henry's observed the field of battle and ordered the burial of the French dead, finding many stripped of their clothing and some mutilated or decapitated by post-mortem dagger wounds. Le Verger's body and those of 6 of his officers were missing, having been removed by Herri for use as trophies, but were later exchanged for Hamu's captured wives. The Zayan later displayed these trophies and captured weapons to nearby tribes to encourage them to support him, a tactic that proved particularly successful with the tribes to the north. Although French forces subsequently fought several successful actions against the Zayan and recovered the captured weapons, El Herri showed that they could be beaten. The battle, along with the siding of the Ottoman Empire with the Central Powers in the First World War and slow French progress on the Western Front, led to increasing numbers of recruits for Hamor. The Zayon War continued for many years after El Herri, with Henry's changing tactics from negotiation and bribery to submit or starve. Subsequent victories in the Middle Atlas restored the French image of superiority in force and led to increasing submissions and the withdrawal of the Zayon deeper into the mountains. By 1917, the French had managed to establish a military road straight through the Middle Atlas, limiting the free movement of the Zayon. The end of the war came through political rather than military means, with Hamur's sons submitting, on his advice, to the French in June 1920. Their submission persuaded 3,000 tents of Zayon to follow, and within 6 weeks just 2,500 tents remained opposed to French rule. Hamor was killed in spring 1921 by a Berber war party led by Hassan, and soon after a combined French and Berber attack on Bekrit defeated the last remaining Zayon force, ending the 7-year-long war. After the war, French expansion in the area continued, and they brought almost the entire Middle Atlas under their control by June 1922. Reasons for French defeat. Though they held him in high regard, Lyautey and Henry's blamed Lavardeur for the defeat, with the latter describing the lieutenant colonel's march from Khenifra as a poorly prepared and poorly executed act of indiscipline. Lavardeur was thought to have underestimated the ability of the Berbers to operate offensively in mountainous terrain against his column. His motive for the inexcusable imprudence of disobeying orders is thought to have been for personal glory and to bring the war to an early conclusion. One of the survivors of the battle, Jean Picon, said that Lavardeur was haunted by the obsessive temptation of defeating Hamor. Lyautey stated, in a letter to Minister of War Alexandre Millerand, that Lavardeur, had he not died on the field, would have deserved the most severe punishment at the hands of a military tribunal. It is thought that Lavardeur's actions may have been influenced by a school of thought, advocated by General Charles Mangan, that bold movements would intimidate the North African tribes into submission. This school of thought was critical of Lyautey's campaign of negotiation backed up by the threat of military power, arguing that it cost too many casualties and that a bolder commander should be appointed instead. Mangin's opinions had many advocates among the French officers of the colonial forces in Morocco, keen to end the war quickly and transfer to the Western Front, were praised by newspapers, books and journal articles in France, and had the support of part of the Chamber of Deputies. Lyautey believed that he had to constantly battle against this school of thought and could not hope to defeat the men who followed it, as they were self-satisfied with its infallibility and convinced of the pitiful inferiority of those who do not submit to it blindly. Legacy. The battle was a shock to the French, who had not expected the tribes to get the better of a well-armed column. Lyautey himself said that, in our entire colonial history there has never been a case of the destruction of such an important force, of the loss of almost all its officers, of the disappearance of so much materiel and booty of war. The battle has been described variously as the worst ever defeat of French forces in Morocco, the worst in North Africa, and one of the worst in the French colonies. The heavy losses suffered at El Herri overshadowed the planning of French military policy for Morocco during the First World War. Today the battle is celebrated by the Moroccan press as a historic event in Moroccan history. Alongside other instances of resistance against French and Spanish occupation, an obelisk was erected near to the battlefield in 1991 and was unveiled by two Moroccan ministers, Moli Ahmed Alawi and Mohamed El Ansar, listing the names of the 182 Moroccan dead. Hamor is recorded on the obelisk as being a proud champion of national resistance. The monument's Arabic text contains some mistakes, recording the French dead at 700 in number and giving the year of the battle as 1912.